we're going to go ahead and get started. And today's topic is about treating childhood traumatic grief. And I'm going to just do a couple of housekeeping items, and I'll let our speaker introduce herself and more of her topic today. So just a couple of housekeeping items. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature, which is found on the right side of your screen. And then this is just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and we will provide a link to this presentation from our website. And so we did have the first question come in. Everyone is about muting your phone. Everyone on the conference line right now is muted, so you don't need to worry about muting your phone. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker today, Sapna John.
Okay, hello everybody, welcome. So my name is Sapna John. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at UAMS. I primarily work with children and adolescents who've experienced traumatic events in their lives, and so I'm excited to be able to talk to you about traumatic grief. I think it's a component of TSCBT that we don't necessarily get a whole lot of talking about, but we do run across quite a bit in our own work. So I'm excited to be able to present to you on it today. Like Chad mentioned, if you have a question, please feel free to jump in. So in general, what I'm hoping to accomplish with you today is a couple things. So first is just in general, how do we differentiate typical grieving from traumatic grief? And then we'll move into really how is traumatic grief incorporated into trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And then we'll actually talk about the specific traumatic grief components. And so I'm making a couple assumptions here in that you have some familiarity with TSCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time focused on those modules in particular. Instead, what I'm going to do is help you to understand how traumatic grief work fits into the modules as they're currently practiced. Okay, so let's get clear on some terms before we get started. So traumatic loss, as it's defined, is really a situation that is terrifying that results in death. It may have also been life-threatening for the child. And so a couple things to keep in mind is that these deaths can be expected or unexpected. And so for some people on our caseload, with the death of a sudden accident or a violent crime, something that was unexpected and really dramatically alters kids' perceptions of things. Likewise, though, oftentimes expected deaths can be just as traumatic. So let's say a caregiver is diagnosed with a chronic illness and a child understands or perhaps doesn't understand that this is going to eventually lead to death. That can also be traumatic. So instead, what I want us to help do is really focus on the degree to which this event is perceived as traumatic by the child. And we'll talk a little bit more about prevalence rates of traumatic grief, but I always want you to keep that in the back of your mind, is how traumatic was this loss for the child. Some would argue really that the loss of certain relationships in your life is always going to be traumatic. So in someone in terms of a parent or someone in a significant caregiving role, some people would say that regardless of the situation of how this happened, this is going to have a dramatic impact on your life, and it's going to be a traumatic stressor for a child. And there are people who will argue both sides of that issue, but it's something I just want us to also keep in mind is the case that I'm going to be presenting on today and kind of bringing in case examples will really illustrate that idea of, is the death of a caregiver always something that's traumatic? And then finally, grief in general is feelings of intense sadness and distress from not only missing the person who died, but also changes that have resulted in your life from someone passing away. So before we talk about traumatic grief, I think it's important to understand what is typical grieving. So what does it typically look like to grieve? And we often call that something called uncomplicated bereavement. So basically, we still see intense sadness and longing for the deceased individual. And there is no typical period of time for bereavement. I know in psychology with DSM, we try to put a specific time frame on things to characterize typical bereavement from something that would be over what we would expect it to. But it really does largely depend on so many things. So it depends on cultural values, it depends on individual characteristics, family impairment. And so instead of really looking at a time frame for understanding what differentiates typical grieving from traumatic grief. Instead, really the defining feature of traumatic grief is that it interferes with the ability for a child to go through this typical bereavement process. And I'll show you a slide coming up that really goes into specific symptoms. But one thing that's really hallmark here is any thoughts or reminders of the person who has passed away triggers maladaptive or difficult reactions. And so in the typical grieving process, eventually what we would hope is that you can remember positive aspects or positive memories of an individual and not have those trigger post-traumatic symptoms. But because of these children's PTSD symptoms, it really gets in the way of them being able to go through this process in a healthy manner. So the symptoms of traumatic grief have a large overlap with PTSD symptoms. So symptoms of avoidance are really avoiding things that would remind the child of the deceased person. And in the case of a caregiver, we can imagine how many things in your life would remind you of this person. So it would be your day-to-day routine and activities. It might be the rooms of the house that you live in. And so avoidance can be a really impairing symptom in PTSD in general, but particularly in traumatic grief. There are the hyperarousal symptoms that we typically see in PTSD that often look like behavioral disorders or behavioral symptoms in children. And then there's the re-experiencing. And in traumatic grief, re-experiencing is additionally complicated because there are a lot of reminders that come up about the person, whether it's death anniversaries, birthdays, significant events that you would have wanted that person around for. But in addition to PTSD symptoms, there also may include symptoms related to grieving, yearning for the loved one, anger at the situation, guilt, or feeling somehow responsible for the death of someone you love. And also in children, particularly, there can be the presence of revenge and rescue fantasies. And we're going to talk more about this when we talk about traumatic grief and the trauma narrative, and when we would really want to address revenge and rescue fantasies, and when we might not consider that to be a battle we want to choose, and in fact may actually help be an adaptive response for kids. So what I want you to understand is that childhood traumatic grief is related to PTSD, but it isn't PTSD entirely. So they are two separate things. So when we look at their correlation or the relationship they have with one another, they're correlated pretty highly, but there's still some unique components of each of those things. And so that's really why it's important to do a thorough assessment of these symptoms to understand, even if someone has lost someone, do they really have traumatic grief symptoms? So how do we recognize this in our kids? So children with traumatic grief will likely have a considerable difficulty or be unwilling to accept the death of a loved one. Bear in mind, before I continue with these, I think it's important to note, some of these things will be age-typical. And so what you're really looking for is age-inappropriate levels of these symptoms. They also tend to have really intense and distressing feelings when they're triggered by reminders, which then leads them to engage in a lot of avoidance. They react very strongly to the change or feel overly responsible for the death of someone. Oftentimes they feel quite guilty in forming any new relationships with individuals in their life, and we know how important social support is for individuals, and this can really contribute to the impairment that they have. They avoid all memories of the person, including positive memories, because they often can't think of the person without also thinking of the death and also experiencing PTSD symptoms. They may resist the process of meaning-making of the death. And then finally, they experience reduced engagement in age-appropriate behaviors and relationships. And so you would really see this functionally impairing them, likely, in a lot of different places. You may see them not wanting to spend time with their friends anymore, not wanting to go to karate practice anymore, not really wanting to do the things we would expect children to do. So what we know now in terms of just children who are grieving potentially is that in 2007, which is the last statistic that I could find, that over 2 million children in the United States receive Social Security benefits due to the death of a parent. And so what we know is that many children in our country are facing the loss of a caregiver. And that's only a caregiver, that's only a parent. grandparents, about best friends, about other people that their death would really make a difference in these kids' lives. But there's some discrepancies over how many of these kids actually develop significant PTSD symptoms. What we know about resilience is many children who experience a trauma do not develop PTSD. And likewise, children who develop the death of a loved one wouldn't necessarily develop traumatic grief. But it's a far-ranging